Howdy folks, it's the Comics Kid 2099, and I'm here to review an animated episode of a television series. This time I'm talking about Batman, the animated series, and the episode in question is On Leather Wings. Let's go! I don't think I have to tell you that I'm a huge fan of the Batman. After all, if you're here watching this video, you've probably seen my collection videos where I've shown off a good portion of my Batman graphic novels. In case you haven't seen those, let me just tell you right now, I love Batman. Now that's not to say that I'm not objective, I try to be all the time, and I do have a couple of complaints about this episode that I'll get to much later. Those complaints, when weighed against everything I love about this episode, well, they're microscopic. So what do I love? This episode, without making it look hard at all, does so much. If you'll remember in the episode of Metabots that I reviewed recently, I talked about how difficult it is to set up the protagonist, the antagonist, what they both want, and the premise of your series. All of that in 20 minutes is very difficult. How well did Batman the Animated Series On Leather Wings do in that regard? It sets up Batman. In just 20 minutes, we get to see him as Batman, we get to see him as Bruce Wayne, and we even get to hear about both sides of Bruce Wayne. When we see him going to talk to Dr. Langstrom, his wife, and his father-in-law, we see him as businessman Bruce Wayne. This is one aspect of him that sometimes gets overlooked, and sometimes it's the only aspect we see. Earlier in the episode, we hear Alfred tell Batman that he needs to call off his date with some girl named Candy or Daphne or whatever. Without actually seeing any of it in the episode, we also get to hear very briefly of the playboy aspect of Batman. Now that's two aspects of Bruce Wayne. And then there's also Batman himself. And over the course of this episode, we see several things about him. He's driven, he's smart, he uses his brains just as much as he uses his fists, and even when his life is arguably at stake, he's going to save other lives. That's what he does. He puts other lives before himself quite often, and that's what makes him a hero. That's one of the things that makes him a hero. It does all of this in less than 20 minutes. It does it in less than 10, actually. Very, very little screen time is even given to Batman, and that's not a bad thing in this case. We still get to see all of who he is in so very little time. It's remarkable how well this is done. Some other things that this episode did well, it introduces us to other aspects of Gotham City. We get to see a police force that's maybe not 100% united. This isn't to say they're corrupt like they are in some of the movies and most of the comic books, but they're just not 100% working together. I'll talk about that in a minute. We also get to see, very briefly, Harvey Dent. He's talking to Commissioner Gordon and the mayor. One thing I will say, I wish this series had given us many more episodes of Harvey Dent before he becomes Two-Face. Unfortunately, if my math isn't wrong, he was in 3 episodes before the episode that introduced him as Two-Face. And I just wish we had gotten him in 10 or 15 episodes before finally getting him as Two-Face, and then by then, we could have gotten a character who we have already come to care about, and then we get to see his tragic fall into villainy. Unfortunately, we only get to see him as a cameo in this episode, and then as a character who's kind of sort of just there in another episode. Oh well, one minor complaint against everything else I love, that's not too bad, right? Let's see, what else do I love here? There's no origin in this episode. That is fantastic. This series first started airing in 1992. Now, as I recall, the first Batman movie that we had had in 20 years aired in 1989, just 3 short years before this. And then we had Batman Returns in 1991. Now, granted, this audience probably wasn't exactly the same as Batman Returns, since that was a kind of gross adult comedy movie, sort of, and this was basically aimed at little children. However, I think it's safe to assume that anyone who's watching Batman is familiar with his origin story. It's not really something that you have to recap every time you do an episode. Pretty much everyone on the planet knows that Batman is Bruce Wayne, his parents were murdered in front of him, and then he sought to eliminate crime as the Batman. It's very easy, you don't need to delve into it a great deal. And I love that this episode doesn't even bother. It treats us like smart people who know things, and we don't have to be dumbed down in order to watch this episode. It's fantastic. Maybe I'm misdiagnosing the reason that they don't show us the origin. After all, this is a children's show. I remember watching this when I was 4 years old. When you have a show for children, it's typically good to not show violent murders to those children. So maybe that's why they're not showing the death of the Waynes and the origin of Batman here. I'm not really sure if they ever got to showing the origin in this series, since I only have the first season, and that's the only season that I've watched recently. However, I do think that not seeing the origin, regardless of why they didn't do it, is props for the show. Kudos to you people. I talk about this quite a bit in my reviews, but I really love the world that this series is set in. We have all kinds of stylized elements that you would think don't really go well together, but they so definitely do go well together. We see computers, we see people in fairly modern dress, but we also see stylized elements that you would think went out of date decades ago, like architecture and weapons and vehicles that look like they come from the 1930s. This is Gotham City to me. I love just about everything about this, and just the whole world looks timeless. You would think that adding elements that existed decades and decades ago, before any of us were born, that would somehow date the series, but it really doesn't. It creates a sense of this could be any time. You could show this episode to someone now, or you could show it to someone 20 years from now, and it's not going to resemble a cartoon from the 90s that uses pop culture, things like that existed in the 90s. There's a scene in this episode where Batman is inside a building, the police force are storming the building, and they're also surrounding the building, and Batman miraculously is able to escape. In a lot of ways, this reminded me of Batman Year One, where he's stuck in a warehouse, the police are trying to come in and find him, and they're all outside, and he somehow manages to escape. I'm not so sure if I can say this about the rest of the series, but I really love how this episode is not afraid to take elements from Batman Year One and incorporate it into this episode. But at the same time, it doesn't feel limited to just Year One. It can take one small scene from Year One and also tell an entirely different story. I don't think you're going to see anybody say, you know, Batman on leather wings, that's kind of a Year One story, because it's not. But it's okay to take one scene from Year One and something that hardcore Batman fans will recognize and say, oh, that's cool. And it is. It's cool. In that regard, this is a lot like the recent movies that we've gotten, like Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. Picks elements from stories but doesn't actually do an adaptation of those stories. I do have a couple of minor gripes about this episode, but like I said, when you love so much about this episode in this series, these gripes feel really inconsequential. Number 1. I really wish that Batman had been an outlaw in the eyes of the police for longer than just one episode. In this episode, the police are sort of the antagonists, more so than Man-Bat is anyway. Almost from the beginning, we see that the police are trying to capture the Batman, and I wish that we had been able to see more of this throughout the series. Now, I think the reason we don't is because they aired these episodes out of order from how they created them. If you look online, you'll see that the first episode they started creating was Claws of the Catwoman Part 1. The second one was On Leather Wings, this episode. But they didn't air them in that way. In fact, when you're watching these on DVD, you'll kind of notice there's a little bit of incongruity there. You see, Robin appears in Christmas with the Joker, the next episode, and then it's almost at the very end of the series before we even see him again. I'm not really sure who I should hold this against. The people creating this show, they really can't control when these episodes are aired or how they're aired, so I'm kind of thinking that it was the network saying, oh, this is a cartoon for children, it's okay if we air them out of order. And if you think about it, cartoons in the 1980s, they didn't really have long-running arcs or things that really mattered if you aired them out of order. You can watch this episode of He-Man and then watch one episode that takes place 4 years later, and it's really not going to make much of a difference. So I'm kind of inclined to say that the networks aired these episodes in an order that they probably shouldn't have aired them, and then when they put them on the DVD, they put them in that order, and so when I'm watching these, I'm kind of thinking there's supposed to be some sort of an arc here, but there's really not. Something I've almost never liked is how Harvey Bullock is handled in this episode. He's not exactly corrupt, and in a way he's always coming into conflict with Jim Gordon. It almost makes him seem like he's not really a good guy. Jim Gordon is a good guy, and when he doesn't like Harvey Bullock for X, Y, and Z, it makes me think that Harvey Bullock is not a good guy. Maybe it's just that I've always misappropriated how Harvey Bullock actually is, but the way I see him is that he's a good cop. He just doesn't like the Batman. Him not liking the Batman, that may kind of make him seem like he's a bad guy, but really, if you think about it, he's a cop, he's doing his job. Batman is a guy who, in theory, is kind of illegal. You know, vigilante activity. That's a boo. Bullock just doesn't like him. But here, he's almost portrayed as not quite villainous, but not quite incompetent. He's sort of just there. The mayor says that Bullock has a good track record of getting results, but we don't really see any evidence of that in this episode or even in later episodes. I don't think there's one instance where Bullock is portrayed as a competent cop. This isn't huge. It's not like he's taking bribes like Eckhart from the 1989 Batman movie, but I kind of wish that they had portrayed him as a decent man who just happens to not like Batman. In a lot of ways, kind of like Crispus Allen later on in the comic books. And my final complaint is that at the end, Batman is trying to chase down Man-Bat so that he can give him a cure that will rid him of this curse that turns him into a monster. And Man-Bat is flying all around Gotham City with Batman attached to his ankle via a little bat rope or whatever. And Batman is dragged through all kinds of stuff, and you would think he would be really beaten up. His face is slammed into the window of a police blimp, and he just has a couple of scratches on his face. They go through all kinds of construction pipes and stuff like that, and you would think that Batman would have broken ribs, broken wrists, things like that, but he's really not hurt at all. And I know this is a cartoon show for little kids, and they're probably not going to be thinking about things like that, but I'm not a little kid. When I'm watching this, I can't help but think that maybe Batman got off a little lighter than he probably should have in this instance. Or, if you don't want to have him break a wrist and actually have consequences for going into a dangerous situation like that, then we probably could have just not had an aerial chase scene that lasted 5 minutes. I think you know where I come down on this episode. It is superb. Definitely watch this series. Not just this episode, this series, and I would say almost every series that is part of this larger world. If you haven't heard of it already, it's called the DC Animated Universe. And the people who created this series, they went on to create 5 or 6 other series spanning this large cohesive universe that lasted something like 15 years. It's really, really awesome. I am Vengeance. I am the Knight. I am the Comics Kid 2099. I'll see you next time.